It is the night of the 12th of July, 1917. You are a soldier, half asleep, in a muddy trench near a small Belgian town called Ypres. Say it, Ypres. You have survived a long time out here, and you have learned the smells of this war the way you once knew the smells of home. Cordite, wet earth, chlorine, sharp and clean like a swimming pool. That means run. You know them all. But tonight, drifting in on the dark, there is a new one. Faint, oily, almost sweet. Something like garlic. Something like horseradish. Something a man beside you says quietly, like mustard. And because it does not choke you, and does not sting, and smells almost like the table back home, you do not run. That is the mistake. Because that gentle, mustard-scented mist is settling onto your skin and into your lungs, and over the next hours, it will begin to blister and burn everything it has touched. It does not need to be breathed to maim you. It will soak through your uniform. It will blind men for weeks, and the soldiers will give this new horror a name drawn from the only thing it reminded them of, the sauce on a ploughman's lunch. They will call it mustard gas. Now hold that thought, a weapon so terrible it defined a war, named after a condiment, and let it sit with you, because it is not a coincidence. It is the end of a very long story. So here is the question this video answers. How did a humble yellow paste, the cheap sauce of the poor, travel from a Roman kitchen to a papal throne to a Belgian battlefield, and end up lending its gentle name to one of the cruelest weapons ever made? To find out, we have to go back to the beginning, to a Roman kitchen and a bowl of something they called burning must. Travel back then, nearly 2,000 years, and step into the kitchen of a Roman household. On the table sits a mortar, and in it, a cook is grinding a small, hard, round seed into a rough paste. The seed itself is almost nothing. Plain, cheap, grown like a weed across the whole Mediterranean world. On its own, it is dull, but the cook pours over it the unfermented juice of freshly pressed grapes, what the Romans called must. And something remarkable happens. The moment the ground seed meets the liquid, a chemical reaction begins, and a fierce heat blooms out of it. Not the heat of fire, the heat of the nose and the eyes. That sharp, stinging, tear-pulling burn you know from a spoonful too eager. To the Romans, it seemed as though the paste itself were burning, so they named it for exactly that. Mustum ardens. Say it, mustum ardens, burning must. Say those two Latin words aloud, slowly, and you can hear a modern word being born inside them. Mustum ardens. Mustard. Mustard. That is the first thing worth understanding about this sauce. Its very name is a description of pain, a small, sharp, culinary violence. The Romans loved it for exactly that. In a world before the great spice routes, before black pepper was pouring in from India, before chili even existed in Europe, heat on the tongue was rare and precious. And here was a plant that grew for free by the roadside and delivered fire for nothing. This is what made it precious. Mustard was the spice of the poor, the pepper of people who could never dream of pepper. A Roman recipe that survives from those centuries lists its ingredients: mustard seed, vinegar, honey, a little spice, and they have barely changed in 2,000 years. What is in the jar in your fridge tonight is very nearly what a Roman soldier spread on his bread. And a Roman soldier is exactly how it traveled. As the legions marched out across Europe, they carried the little seeds with them and scattered them. And mustard took root wherever Rome did, in Germany, in Britain, and above all, in the cool green valleys of a region of France that would one day make it world famous. The Romans gave mustard its fire and its name, but it was in France, in the hands of monks and then a mustard-mad pope, that the burning paste would become something no one could have predicted. It would become power. It is the early 1300s, and the most powerful man in the Christian world is not living in Rome. He is living in the south of France, in the city of Avignon, say it Avignon, where the papacy has moved for a strange and turbulent chapter of its history. And this pope, John the 22nd, has a weakness. It is not gold or war or any of the usual sins of powerful men. It is mustard. He loves it. He puts it, by some accounts, on very nearly everything. And being the Pope, being a man who can reshape the world with a signature, he does something about his love that only the truly powerful can do. He does not simply hire a good cook. He creates out of nothing a brand new official office of the papal court, a title, a rank. The Grand Moutardier du Pape, say it Moutardier du Pape, the Grand Mustard Maker to the Pope. Picture the seriousness of that. In a court full of bishops and diplomats and princes, there is now an official, salaried position whose entire purpose is the Pope's mustard, and the story that clings to it makes it perfect. The Pope, it is said, had a nephew, an idle, good-for-nothing young man from near Dijon, the sort of embarrassing relative every powerful family has to deal with. And so this new and dignified office, Grand Mustard Maker to the Pope, became the solution to two problems at once. It fed the Pope's obsession, and it gave the useless nephew a job he could not possibly ruin. It is one of history's great jokes. But underneath the joke, something serious is happening. Because when the most powerful man in Europe declares that a food is worthy of a court title, the whole continent takes notice. Mustard, the free weed of the roadside, the source of the Roman poor, was suddenly the favorite of the papal throne. And one town was perfectly placed to seize that moment: Dijon. The town of Dijon, in the mustard-growing heart of Burgundy, threw itself into the craft. Its dukes adopted a proud motto, Molt Mutard, that happened to echo the sound of the word itself. Its makers refined the paste, swapping the old grape must for sharp vinegar, and produced something finer and stronger than anyone else. And the authorities began, carefully, to protect it. As early as the 1390s, French rules declared that real mustard could contain nothing but good seed and suitable vinegar, a medieval war on cheap imitations. And in time, the mustard makers of Dijon organized themselves into a guild, with masters and apprentices and strict statutes, guarding the secret of their trade like the crown jewels. The poor man's sauce had become a luxury, with laws to defend it. But a monopoly, as these stories so often show, is a fragile and dangerous thing to build a fortune on. For centuries, it worked. Dijon mustard became one of the most prized condiments in Europe, a fixture on the tables of French kings, a point of civic pride, a genuine luxury export. The feasts of the powerful ran on it in quantities that sound made up. At one single ducal banquet in the 14th century, by the records that survive, the guests are said to have got through around 70 gallons of mustard. 70 gallons at one dinner. The makers of Dijon guarded their craft jealously, and the name of their town became, across the world, a promise of quality, the way champagne or Parmesan would later become. And in the 1700s, two men named Gray and Poupon combined an old recipe with a new mustard-making machine and put the craft on an industrial footing. Their shop still stands in Dijon. Their names, Gray Poupon, you have very probably seen on a jar. But here is the quiet trap hidden inside every monopoly built on a name. A name is not a fence. Dijon's makers guarded their recipes, their guild, their reputation. What they could not do was own the plant. Mustard, remember, is the weed that grows for free by the roadside. The whole reason it was the spice of the poor in the first place. And so, inevitably, Dijon mustard stopped meaning mustard from Dijon and started meaning merely a style, a way of making it that anyone, anywhere, could copy. Today, the vast majority of so-called Dijon mustard is not made in Dijon at all. Much of the very seed that built the town's fame is now grown on the other side of the world, in Canada. A town that had made itself the center of the mustard universe slowly became just a name on a jar, a style, a flavor, an idea, detached from the place that gave it birth. And there is a deeper fall here too, and a stranger one. Because at the very moment Dijon was perfecting its expensive, refined, aristocratic mustard, the thing that had made mustard matter for 2,000 years was quietly dying. Its job was being taken. For all of history, mustard had been precious for one reason. It was the cheap, homegrown source of heat, the poor person's answer to unaffordable pepper. But the spice routes had opened. Pepper, once worth its weight in silver, was becoming ordinary. Chili had crossed the ocean from the Americas. Suddenly there was heat everywhere, cheap and abundant, from 100 sources. The little burning seed that had been the only fire a poor family could afford was no longer special. It settled down into what it is today, a friendly, familiar, everyday squirt of yellow, comfortable, ordinary, forgotten, which is precisely when its name was dragged onto a battlefield and made to mean something monstrous. Before we return to that battlefield, we have to make one more stop, because the mustard most of the world actually eats is not the fierce brown paste of Dijon at all. It is something brighter, milder, and much younger. Now step forward in time to the city of Rochester, in the American state of New York, in the year 1904. Two brothers named Robert and George French are about to change what the word mustard means to hundreds of millions of people. These brothers understood something about the American palate. The old world mustards were sharp, dark, and aggressive. Too much for a public raised on milder food. So the French brothers made a gentler one, softened and smoothed. And they did one more thing that changed everything. They colored it a bright, sunny, unmissable yellow, using the spice turmeric. They unveiled it, the story goes, at the World's Fair, served on a hot dog, and it was perfect. That soft, mild, brilliant yellow stripe was exactly right for the food of the new American century. The ballpark, the backyard, the barbecue. It became one of the most recognizable colors in the entire world of food. To this day, when you picture mustard, the color that appears in your mind was very likely invented in Rochester to sell more hot dogs. Think about that for a moment. The mustard the Romans burned their tongues on. The mustard a pope built a throne-side office around. The mustard Dijon, guarded like gold. For most people alive today, all of that history has been painted over by a cheerful yellow squirt invented barely a century ago to go on fast food. And that bright, friendly, all-American yellow matters enormously for the last part of our story, because it is the color, as much as the smell, that would give a weapon its name. The mustard plant itself, understand, is entirely innocent in what comes next. It never hurt anyone. The seed that grows by the roadside has no more to do with poison gas than a lemon does. What happened was a collision of the senses, a yellow-brown color, and a sharp, oily mustard and garlic smell that led terrified soldiers to reach, in the dark, for the only word that fit. And so we arrive, at last, back in the trench at Ypres, where this whole story began, to meet the thing that stole Mustard's gentle name, and to understand why the theft was so cruel and so complete. Because the substance the soldiers were smelling that night had, chemically, nothing whatsoever to do with mustard. And that is what makes it one of the darkest borrowings in the history of language. The weapon that drifted into that trench had a real name, a cold chemical one, sulfur mustard. But there is no mustard in it, not a seed, not a leaf, not a trace of the plant. It was born not in a kitchen, but in a laboratory, first synthesized by chemists in the 1800s, long before anyone thought to turn it into a weapon. It is not really a gas either. It is an oily liquid that hangs in the air as a fine, heavy mist and then settles, like a poison dew, onto everything below. What it does is uniquely, deliberately cruel. Most of the war gases that came before it killed quickly or not at all. Chlorine choked you, and it was over. Mustard did not want to kill you quickly. It blistered the skin. It scorched the eyes, often blinding men for weeks. It seared the lungs from the inside. And worst of all, it was patient. A soldier could be soaked and feel almost nothing for hours, thinking himself lucky, before the agony began. It first swept across the battlefield near Ypres in the summer of 1917, and it changed the war. It could not be stopped by the gas masks of the day, because it did not need to be breathed. It attacked any skin it touched. It sank into the mud of the trenches and lingered there for days, so that ground itself became the weapon. It did not win battles so much as fill hospitals and haunt the men who survived it for the rest of their lives. And the soldiers, reaching for a word, gave it the name that has stuck ever since. Because of its faint, oily, mustard and garlic smell and its dirty yellow-brown color, they called it mustard gas. Sit with the cruelty of that for a second. The oldest, humblest, most harmless food on the table, the source of the Roman poor, the joy of a mustard-loving pope, the pride of Dijon, had its harmless name stolen and bolted onto one of the most feared weapons ever devised. Every time we say mustard gas, we are, without knowing it, slandering a roadside weed that never hurt a soul. And here the story turns one final, strange corner, because the very poison that borrowed mustard's name would, in a twist almost too neat to believe, go on to save lives by the millions. In the decades after the war, doctors studying what mustard gas did to the body noticed something. It savagely attacked fast-dividing cells, and cancer, they realized, is fast-dividing cells. The chemical cousins of that battlefield horror became the world's very first chemotherapy drugs, some still in use today. The thing that blinded and burned men at Ypres learned, in the end, to fight the deadliest disease we know. Pull all the way back now and look at the whole strange arc of this little seed. Because there is a thread running through every chapter of it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Mustard has spent its entire existence being underestimated. It began as a weed, a plant so common, so cheap, so beneath notice that it grew in the ditches and the field edges and the cracks of the ancient world. It was the spice of people who had no spices, a plant nobody had to pay for, the fire of those who had nothing. And every single time in history that it rose above that station, when a pope crowned it, when Dijon guarded it, when Gray and Poupon bottled it, the world eventually pulled it back down, because you cannot, in the end, make a fortune out of a weed that grows for free. That is mustard's real story. Not a rise and not a fall, but a refusal to stay important. It is the food that will not be made precious. Every attempt to turn it into treasure has slid, sooner or later, back into the ordinary, back to the cheap yellow squirt, the free packet at the counter, the jar in the door of the fridge that you never think about at all. And maybe that is the most honest kind of greatness there is. Mustard asks for nothing. It has fed the poorest people on earth for thousands of years without ever demanding to be treasured. Pepper needed empires. Sugar needed slaves. Saffron needed a fortune. Mustard needed only a roadside and a little rain, and it gave its small, sharp fire to anyone, prince or pauper, who wanted it. The Romans understood it. They did not prize it because it was rare. It was never rare. They prized it because it was faithful. It was the one bit of fire an ordinary person could always afford. And it has stayed faithful, quietly, ever since, through the rise and fall of every empire that ever tried to cage it. So the little seed outlasted them all. It outlasted the Caesars, who carried it across Europe. It outlasted the Pope, who loved it, and the town that hoarded it. It even, in a way, outlasted the war that stole its name. Because today, when a child squeezes a yellow line onto a hot dog, no one is thinking of Ypres. The source won. The weapon is a museum piece. The seed goes on. Which brings us back, as these stories always do, to your own kitchen, and to the most quietly extraordinary jar you own. Go and open your fridge. There, in the door, beside the ketchup, behind something you should probably have thrown out weeks ago, is a jar of mustard. Yellow or brown, cheap or fancy, it has been there so long you have stopped seeing it. It cost you almost nothing. It will outlive most of the food around it, and you have never once thought of it as anything but ordinary. But hold it up to the light for a moment, and look at what is actually in your hand. In your hand is the oldest prepared sauce in the Western world, a recipe so ancient that a Roman legionary would recognize the taste of it on his tongue. In your hand is the paste the Caesars called burning must, the fire the ancient world's poorest reached for when pepper was a dream. Here is the obsession of a medieval pope who loved this exact flavor so much he invented a title for the man who made it. Here is the treasure that built a French town, and the humble weed that quietly refused, again and again, to stay a treasure. And you are holding a name that was carried, one terrible night near Ypres, onto a battlefield, and given to a weapon that blistered men blind, and then, impossibly, learned to cure the sick. All of that history, all of that blood and reverence and fire, sitting in your fridge door, in a squeezy bottle, for about $1. That is the strange gift buried in this jar, and it is worth saying plainly before we finish. We spend our lives chasing the rare and the expensive, certain that value lives in scarcity, in the pineapple, the saffron, the gold. But here, in the cheapest thing on the shelf, is a story richer than almost anything money can buy. The cheapest thing on the shelf has very often seen the most. The little seed that cost nothing and asked for nothing has watched empires rise and fall, sat at the tables of popes and paupers alike, given its name to horror, and outlived every single person who ever tried to own it. It asks nothing of you. It never has. So the next time you reach past that jar without a glance, stop, just for a second, and give the old weed its due. It was burning tongues when Rome ruled the world, and it will very likely be doing it long after we are all gone. That is the true history of mustard, the poor man's fire that fed the world, and named a weapon, and never once asked to be remembered. Here's what I want you to do before you go. Open your own fridge and find the one thing in the door you never think about. The jar, the bottle, the tub that's been there for years. Tell me in the comments what it is. because there's a very good chance it's hiding a story just as strange as this one. And it might just be the next video. Subscribe and stick around, and let's go digging together. There's a new one every week.